Having looked at the model of the brain, we're now ready to look at the 3D image of the brain online. I've sent you the website for this. Bear in mind that since this website's never been updated, labels do not appear on the diagram anymore, which is unfortunate. However, in the handout, the PowerPoint that I'm going to send you, and that will also have an audio associated with it, we'll label each of these structures in a static view. But for right now, we want to look at this dynamically from a 3D perspective. So clearly we are looking at the brain at its anterior section. Here, of course, are the temporal lobes. With the frontal lobe, we have here the orbitofrontal, and then the dorsolateral here, up here, and then the ventrolateral here, and then the medial is here. Of course, we can't see the interior part because that's inside the sulcus there. And if we turn the brain sideways, oops, sorry, let's go back this way first. We again can kind of see the orbitofrontal, the ventrolateral, and the dorsolateral. Again, turning to the medial side, we now can see the cingulate gyrus, which surrounds the corpus callosum. Here, the orbitofrontal is more obvious. And here we have the medial prefrontal cortex, and that is sometimes divided into the ventromedial or the dorsomedial. But in a lot of texts, this region here is simply referred to as the medial prefrontal cortex. And that's to be distinguished, very importantly, from the cingulate gyrus, which is then divided into the rostral cingulate, the dorsal cingulate, and the posterior cingulate gyrus. And these are also outlined in the text. So now let's look at the brainstem. And if we turn to get to the anterior view, we see primarily the pons. This is all the basal ganglia that I'll get to in a moment. And we come to the rear, looking at it from the now really the dorsal view. Remember, the brain is bending over. Here, the dorsal view, we see the colliculi. Here are the inferior colliculi, which are auditory relay stations, and the superior colliculi, which are visual relay stations. Together, all four of these colliculi form the tegmentum. Tegmentum is Latin for roof, and the tegmentum is over the channel that connects the third and fourth ventricle. So those are the main things we need to know about for the brainstem. In a subsequent view and in the model, we're going to look at the brainstem split right down the middle, and that will give us access to look at where the cell bodies of the various major major neurotransmitters, particularly norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin are, and that's to come. Now let's take a look at the basal ganglia. And again, let me rotate to the anterior view. And here is where it becomes very important to get the three-dimensional perspective. Here we see the caudate. This is the head of the caudate here. Here, of course, is the dorsal striatum. So the caudate and putamen together, here's the putamen, are referred to as the striatum. The upper part is the dorsal striatum, and here, of course, is the ventral striatum. And this pink part you see here, that is the ventral striatum, or more specifically, the nucleus accumbens. So the ventral striatum is kind of the geographic region on the bottom of the striatum. The nucleus accumbens is a region within the ventral striatum that's going to be very important in terms of modulating our response to reward. And we're going to talk more about that in just a second. Here we see the globus pallidi. This is the externa and the interna. In the model, it was presented just as a simple mound on the medial side of the putamen. Here you can see it, those two structures separated. Now, if we turn to look from the lateral view, now we can see the full putamen. We have the head of the caudate, the body of the caudate, the tail of the caudate that swings around, and this structure that is grayed out here is the amygdala, and we'll get a better view of that shortly. So again, we come back now all the way around to the anterior view. Again, we have in purple the dorsal striatum, head of the caudate; in pink, the ventral striatum with the nucleus accumbens within it. Right. Now we're going to take a look at the corpus callosum. That's the white matter that connects the two hemispheres. There's the midline of the corpus callosum. And now we are ready to go to the limbic system. So looking at the anterior view, the hippocampus, which is in green, the amygdala is in blue, kind of looks like a Klingon warship. You can see the hippocampi bilaterally, and here is the white matter coming up to form the fornix. This kind of pinkish color here, that is the hypothalamus bilaterally. See how the two walls of the hypothalamus form the walls of the third ventricle. So now let's rotate around. Actually, let's go the other way. And now we can see the limbic system in more detail. We can also see the beginning, the formation of the Pepez circuit. Again, there is the amygdala. You can see how it sits anterior and slightly dorsal to the hippocampus. Here the white matter is coming up and is forming the body of the fornix. There is the column of the fornix, and we're coming down here to the mammillary body. Here again is the cingulate gyrus, rostral anterior cingulate gyrus, dorsal anterior cingulate gyrus, and posterior cingulate gyrus. Let's take the full lateral view here. And again, amygdala, hippocampus, and the fornix. Now, as I turn it here, you'll see this structure in purple. Very interesting. This is the stria medullaris. Stria means street in Latin. So it's carrying white matter to a structure called the habenula. There is the lateral habenula. Now, if I bring us to a posterior view or a dorsal view, what you see here is the two lateral habenula, and then they connect together in the middle to form the medial habenula. Now, I did not discuss the habenula in the book. I'm going to add some discussion of that in the seminar this year because the habenula has turned out to be very important in terms of our response to reward, and in fact is sometimes referred to as the anti-reward center. It is also important in addictive disorders. But this is probably the best way to get a view of where the habenula is. It's very difficult to visualize in other neuroanatomy textbooks that give you only a three-dimensional picture. And that concludes our, one last thing, and we'll talk about this more in the next video. The Pepez circuit, which is going to run into the hippocampus through the fornix down to the mammillary body, to the anterior thalamus, which is not shown here, then to the cingulate gyrus, back to the hippocampus, and then ultimately to the hypothalamus. A little more detail on that in just a moment. Finally, we're going to look at the thalamus. And as I mentioned in the model, the thalamus is kind of like an egg. You can see that much more clearly now, sitting in that sort of curve of the hippocampus and the fornix. And our model here doesn't really break it down into the various nuclei, but of course the anterior thalamic nuclei are those that form part of the Pepez circuit and the limbic system. Also, the dorsal medial nuclei here are also part of the limbic system. Now, for completeness, we'll look at the temporal lobe. It will come up more in our discussions later around cognition, but here are the three major gyruses: superior, middle, and inferior.